Hello, and welcome to the very first episode of the Thought Police Archives. I'm Reverend Casey, your host. I am also the founder and lead designer for Thought Police Interactive Studios, an indie publisher of role-playing games and role-playing game toolkits. To start off, we're going to open up with talking about the Motif Way, which is what we call our approach and perspective on role-playing game design and a lot of our preferences regarding play. To start off, we should talk about our broad perspective, which is, what kind of role-playing game experience and play flow are we looking to create with our games and toolkits, or what are they best designed for? Could be another way to look at it. And that answer is emergent sandbox role-playing, which may sound a little complicated or even pretentious at first, but it's a lot more straightforward than it sounds like. To start off with, what's emergent mean? What is emergence? Well, emergence can be looked at in two ways for our usage of it. In one way, it is that the sum is more than the whole of its parts. You can create incredibly complex patterns and behavior with just a small handful of relatively simple rules. Our favorite example of that is bird flocking, with just a small handful of just these really simple mathematical rules, such as the difference between the front and back of the flock or in between the individual birds, can replicate the incredibly intricate, complex, beautiful patterns that bird flocks take when they're in flight and sort of twist and turn around. And that's just a insanely complicated physical pattern, but it only takes a small handful of simple rules to make it happen. The other way to look at emergence is sort of the organic evolution or just the natural flow of things. For example, most of you have probably had a player character where you put a lot of thought into it and it was very well detailed, but you still encountered decisions and issues within the game that were new. Essentially, filled in more about their character or added some nuance and details to that predetermined mindset. And they just sort of emerged. And so there you go. That's, emergence. There's not really, this whole complicated philosophical thing to it. It just sort of is what it is. Another good example of emergence is even when you have a very scripted module or adventure, different playthroughs can turn out really quite differently. For example, if you're playing a high lethality adventure, you have a module where it's just sort of expected that characters are going to die. One playthrough could be very deadly serious. Everybody puts thought into how their characters would be, considering that they grew up in this bitter, harsh world where they're willing to undertake what, is basically a suicide mission. And then in contrast, you could have another playthrough where everybody just sort of makes joke characters because they're kind of disposable anyways, and it's just, a comedy of errors and laugh riot sort of approach to that material. And so you can have this exact scripted, very narrow path module and still come out with very different emergent behaviors, depending on sort of the inputs, in this case, of the player attitudes and the kind of characters they make. And that brings us to a sandbox. So, what is a sandbox? What does that even mean? What distinguishes a sandbox is the freedom that players have to explore and define the story. It's this open world. Even if it's very finely detailed and every little last city, has its own NPCs and plot lines and places and events going on, there's still no pre-scripted story to it for the players to go through. essentially, they react to that world just as their characters would react, without concern for, well, we're playing this assault on this particular keep. Well, no, this is an open world. They may choose to assault the Lich King in his keep, or they may decide to go off and explore rumors of an unusually colored dragon far out in the desert, or they may, and so on. There's really an endless number of possibilities of things they could do and find interest in, and the story as such is really driven by the player actions. You can start off very often with an opening meeting or a starter mission, which isn't necessarily fully defined. It could just be pointing the characters in a direction. But a lot of times people do start off with something a little bit more structured to help get the momentum going and get people started, to help them overcome the choice paralysis of, there's this infinite world, what do I do? Sandboxes can also come almost completely undefined. You can start off with your general setting and just sort of a broad outline of the world, or you may just have details that are very locally focused and connected with the PCs to start. And then everything kind of gets filled in as you go along, whether that's through GM creativity, everybody at the table sort of collaboratively telling the story. Or you could use a GM emulator like the Motif story engine to have something to ask the questions like you would ask a GM, and generate randomized answers to help introduce that uncertainty and an unexpected element. But really, a sandbox is defined by being sort of this big box filled with sand that people can take and shape into their own stories. And we found that it generally sort of describes what a lot of role players already do. In a vampire game, they may have their vampiric prince and court all defined. They may have some of the antagonists, like a werewolf group or something, defined, and a bunch of different influence holders and such. But in the end, what really happens is usually up to the players. There's not usually a preset plot. The plot is players reacting to the world and the world reacting to them. And that sort of makes together what I would call a living world. You have your basic things that are going on within the world, your sandbox setup, and then you have Emergence, and when you put them together, it creates this really rich experience relative to the amount of effort that you have to invest. With an Emergent Sandbox approach, you can write essentially what will last an entire campaign, if not a couple of them, for what would normally be on a more on rails and detailed kind of approach, maybe, like one adventure arc. And it's because you're letting the players and sort of the setting itself do the heavy lifting. Which brings us to sort of what we called in the article version in the series about the Motif Way, genre-rooted theme supreme. And so what does that even mean? Well, we mean rooted in genre. Genre is just sort of the general type of story, whether you're talking about survival horror or Regency romance. That's your genre. Everybody understands the basic concept of genre. What kind of story are we talking about? And themes are sort of the subgenres or topics, these recurring concepts within the story. The example we use in the article version is in a post-apocalyptic survival game, you can have these themes like isolation, struggle against nature, paranoia, and yearning for community. So genre-rooted theme supreme doesn't really mean anything but rooted in the type of story you're telling with these recurring motifs just emphasized. It doesn't necessarily assume a well-defined setting in terms of all the fine little details, but it does assume a well-defined setting in terms of the mood and tone, the feel that it's going for. As an example, we publish a game called No Angels Live Here, and it's a neo-noir occult detective RPG. And the emphasized themes within it are struggle against evil, determination, temptation, personal horror, and corruption. Before knowing anything else, you can probably already think of just an endless variety of possible stories within that framework. Now, key to this perspective is looking at the sort of fluff versus rules debate within the tabletop role-playing community as an illusion or a distraction. People often make this distinction between fluff and rules. The rules are your literal rules of the game, your RPG system. And fluff is said to be more or less kind of everything else. A setting description without a mechanic is the basic example of what fluff is considered to be, and we just reject this distinction at Thought Police. Fluff really provides as much, if not more, play guidance as the mechanics do. If you're talking about this dark, gritty world where corruption is endemic, well, bribery means a very different thing in that world than in this utopian science fiction city or a place that's, has a much higher kind of moral standard. There's no defined mechanic to that. There's no special rule that says, bribery in this world is easier. There's a dice bonus, or bribery in this world is harder. There's a dice penalty. But such world facts and the practical realities of the settings that you're playing in clearly influence the play possibilities and the outcomes from player actions. You can argue that fluff is what actually provides meaning for actions and roles, rather than any given chart or description of the mechanical result. So let's say you're playing a modern horror game and you're trying to inflict harm, cause damage. Well, on who or what? Is it the werewolf? Can you even harm them? Do you have anything that can harm them? Why are you trying to harm them? What's going on? How did you encounter them? What kind of hostility do you have between each other? Are you a hunter? Are they a feral monster? What's going on? And these are the kinds of questions that are answered by the setting details, by the fluff. What harms them in that game? Well, that depends entirely on the setting. Is it dogwood? Silver? Wolfsbane? Similarly, why you're attacking them can be based on the setting and the individual characters. Are you poachers hunting them for parts? Are you heroes? Confronting and battling a monster? Are you this driven, obsessed monster hunter? Why you're in this conflict means as much and really so much more than the spelled out mechanics. They're the source of the meaning and they define your play. As another example, okay, we'll talk about the crew in a spaceship, right? Are you space pirates? Are you privateers? Are you galactic agents? Are you long haulers? Fairly simple, basic questions about what the game is about, what's going on, about the genre and the themes, result in this really different game, even if you're using the same basic mechanics. And so that's kind of where we're at on that, really. And so that kind of flows into concept. Okay, concept is genre plus themes. So ideally, the concept of a game spells out or clearly implies the genre and themes of a game. And our recommendation to both GMs and other game designers is, if not, rephrase the description. So here's some brief examples that we wrote out regarding genre and themes and a concept. So concept number 1, high adventure and space RPG about pirates surviving in the outer worlds. And so we're looking at a sci-fi action adventure with piracy, survival, lawlessness, and peril. A weird fiction indie film game where players portray the good-natured but tempted descendants of demons in college, right? Well, we're talking weird fiction, literary fiction, with, nobility, temptation, school tropes, and family history. A classic RPG fantasy story focused on would-be heroes taking on evil kings. Okay, it's pretty classic. It's we have a heroic fantasy with adventure, corruption, tyranny, justice, and rebellion. And so you can pick out the genre pretty well just by the name of the concept, and you can see how the themes are fairly obvious. One thing we encourage a lot is when you're playing these, pretty much any kind of game, think about the types of stories that those genres and themes usually tell. And you know what? You probably already did it to some degree when you first heard those examples. That's part of why we emphasize that kind of thing, because sometimes we're consciously aware of that knowledge and the assumptions that come with it, but we have this sort of cultural immersion, and it provides like a knowledge and some assumed common features. And that's why if you offer to play, we'll say, a zombie survival horror game, or an off-the-wall cartoon comedy game, those are meaningful statements to potential players because they understand the kind of genre and themes, the kind of concept that you're talking about. Even if they're not intimately familiar with that particular subgenre or that particular type of fiction or movie, they'll still have enough of a sense of it that they'll get the broad strokes. They'll generally understand what direction you're sort of pointing in. And that leads into another thing that you should do, or we encourage you to do, and we call that setting genre roots, or setting concept roots. Assume what your genre assumes, except when you clearly mean otherwise. I mean, twists and playing against tropes are a common way to make things novel and interesting, but those are exceptions to the general narrative. A slasher movie with smart or genre-aware victims is still a slasher movie. While the twist on the victims may be interesting or provide interesting opportunities for play, it's still only meaningful within the context of slasher horror. The genre, even with subversions, is still at the root. It still is what it is. People love stories and narratives. It's really deep in our bones. It goes back to earliest civilization, okay? And not everybody is a voracious reader or a film scholar or anything like that. So they may not have the, proper or correct language and terms for different genres and types of fictions. Still, the average person can describe dozens, if not really hundreds upon hundreds of genres. Sometimes this is by relation, like you could frame it saying, oh, this is like stories by this famous author. People just intuitively get the concept of genre, the idea of types of stories. And so when you make genre assumptions, just a ton of heavy lifting for world building is done for you. For most of the general world details, you can easily imagine them based on the story type. In a high school drama, it's a fairly simple matter to fill the setting with mean girls, the cool teacher, the bully, and and so on. Similarly, the natural flow of events is just intuitive when you lean into a genre. The school is having an anti-bullying campaign. Well, of course, there's going to be a bully storyline. Tropes are just absolutely amazing RPG tools. Tropes are just really a fancy name for all the common things in stories. Every genre is loaded with tropes. You have all just a dream, elves versus dwarves, evil all along, as examples of common tropes. The killer will probably relentlessly advance in a slasher horror. The mean girls will show up right as you decide to run for class president in a high school drama. They're easy story beats to know and follow because they're common genre tropes. And so when you set down those roots it really goes back to encouraging what we talked about before with Emergence. Instead of having to figure everything out on your own, when you follow the basic genre beats, it's going to feel right or natural to your players. And it's also just going to take so much heavy lifting off of you, whether you're solo role-playing, whether you're playing, whether you're GMing, to just sort of assume what the genre assumes. And then, jumping off of that, you want to spotlight your themes. A lot of themes flow straight from the genre. And it's just, even specific genres can still express different themes. Sometimes it's a matter of choosing which tropes you're going to use. Okay, well, we're playing that survival horror. Are the characters hapless victims, or are they monster hunters? And a lot's going to come from those really basic starter sort of assumptions and choices. But there's still going to be a lot left to define things, and that's where your themes really come in. A science fiction action-adventure story could focus on outlaw bounty hunters paying off debts. And that can mean a lot of things, even if that description is itself evocative. Are we talking about themes of betrayal, redemption, and confronting villainy? Sort of that redemption arc kind of classic story when you get into Outlaws? Or are its themes more about, like, thrill-seeking and taking these high-stakes risks and the found family that you have involved in these difficult circumstances? And they're very, very different games. But they both fit the description. And the distinction between them is the themes that they emphasize. But still, even the same base themes can follow a wide variety of uses. The same role-playing game can emphasize a variety of themes and approaches. They even may be different genres within the same game. For example, make a game called Never Stop Smiling, which is a setting, a post-apocalyptic setting, and you have these metros where death is an illusion. It's temporary at worst. And this one's set in the happy place, where it is literally the law to never stop smiling, under the belief that that is part of what maintains their immortality and protection from the broken world. With that very specific concept, you can support straight and serious play, or this surrealist, absurdist kind of approach, or even outright kind of comedic, satirical kind of play feel. But it still has unifying genres and themes. The relationship between comedy and horror is widely recognized. And also, it is its very distinct post-apocalyptic setting with the struggles that implies. And so this unique combination of themes and genres is what makes Never Stop Smiling what it is in any play mode. What exact themes you choose to highlight will define the shape of the gameplay and the direction of your story. Taking that into direct design, mechanics should ideally always reflect your genre and theme. One of the common recurring discussions in tabletop role-playing game circles is about games where there's dissonance between the mechanics and the kinds of themes or play feel that is supposed to be generated by that game. Essentially, it's a broken mechanic. It's no different than a pair of rules that contradict each other. Again, remember that we don't see a distinction between fluff and rules. They're the same thing. They both shape play. And so we think that's where a lot of it comes from, is the distinction between fluff and rules. That fluff is sort of othered from the mechanics of a game. And so when you have this separation, it often creates kind of a separation in development. So, if it's supposed to be a gritty grind in this dark, horrible world, but staying alive is trivial, there's something out of place. If you expect, on a different angle, if you expect a game with big damn heroes, but it's difficult to really do anything successfully, the experience is not going to be satisfying. Everything must work together. All of the rules, the setting, and the mechanics. And so the mechanics of the game should emphasize the genre and themes. In Never Stop Smiling, the themes of decay, instability, danger, dark secrets, and post-apocalyptic society are kind of baked into the rules. There's a system for instability and madness. There's resource stones for favors and secrets. But placing them front and forward on the character sheet and making them key mechanics, the entire shape of play is influenced. It also encourages players to feel as those themes matter in kind of a concrete way. And even universal mechanics are best suited to certain types of RPGs. The rules and runs in Motif games are not good for combat simulation in quote-unquote objective settings. They are good for open world and sandbox games that emphasize themes and focus on player characters as the lead protagonists and scale reference. Each implementation of a rule system should emphasize the genre and themes different ways. In some cases, this can be just a simple case of reskinning the rule. What measured weirdness now measures general chaos, for example. In other instances, it could mean more substantial changes to the rules options and character builds. The scale of a single damage level in a kaiju game should be a distinct thing from the same thing in a street-level RPG with regular people. And, the single level of damage in a kaiju game attacking street-level characters just be completely out of scale and devastating. And we'll get into that a little bit more, I think, in the next episode. We'll start off by talking about focus and flow, and we'll also get into the core oracles of the Motif engine and sort of the mechanical approach of how it does things. Again, I'm Reverend Casey, and this is Thought Police Archives. Thank you so much for tuning in, and hopefully we'll catch you next time. Thanks for having me.